the spectrum of things I thought were available to me as a career were really narrow. I thought you could be in finance, maybe you could be a doctor, you could be a lawyer. Starting in college, I got really fixated on getting into finance because I felt I could make a lot of money doing it. And then I wasn't good at it. I wasn't smart enough. I was surrounded by a bunch of people that were a lot more passionate about it, a lot better at it, a lot smarter than I was. But I found myself going on a project to work on the IMAX film. I met the founders there as part of that project. And I remember really clearly this sense of like, oh my gosh, like that's incredible. These guys did this in a garage and conceived and then built this business. And that was the first real switch to drop for me. And I literally went back to New York and into my offices and I gave notice 2 weeks later because I realized that I was on a path that I was not going to be good at it because I just didn't have the skill set to thrive there.
Hi, I'm Chris Waddell. Welcome to Living It, the podcast where we join experts in the experience of being human. Be bold. Say yes to adventure. Say yes to living it. Welcome to Chris Waddell Living It. Today, super excited. Longtime friend, Bayard Winthrop, founder and CEO of American Giant. American Giant, if you don't know what American Giant is, you need to know what American Giant is because they are making super cool clothing in the US. This is going back like decades. They are reviving the whole industry and it's really cool. What is it? Slate Magazine, and we'll get into this. Slate Magazine said that it's the greatest hoodie ever made. I think that probably changed your life to a certain extent, Bayard. Bayard, thank you for joining me.
Chris, thanks for having me. It's great to see you, man.
It's always a pleasure. Now, when I look at your career, Bayard, you are an entrepreneur. I know, I love the snicker, right? My career. You're so creative.
Don't look too hard.
Well, what's kind of funny about it, though, how did you end up being in the entrepreneur world? But also, I've heard you say you started in finance. I mean, you started on that sort of narrow path of like, this is the way that you're supposed to be successful in this world. But not only did you deviate from that, but you deviated and went into the outdoor world and the apparel where, the margins, the dividends, are not nearly what they are in the financial world. So how did that happen? Was it a conscious decision?
Yeah, it's funny you are asking me about that. I was literally just having a conversation about this with my CFO that, Chris, you and I are roughly the same age. And I've thought a lot about when we were coming into our professional lives, at least for me, you kind of, the spectrum of things I thought were available to me as a career were really narrow. I thought you could be in finance, maybe you could be a doctor, you could be a lawyer. It never really occurred to me. And then I think for my mom, there was also this, you do something productive with your hands. You could be a carpenter, you could be a landscaper or some other thing. But it never occurred to me that there were all these other choices, career choices that were out there. And starting in college, I got really fixated on getting into finance because I felt I could make a lot of money doing it. And it's kind of what a lot of successful fathers in my town were doing. And finally got a job after a bunch of summer jobs in finance. And then I wasn't good at it. I wasn't smart enough. I was surrounded by a bunch of people that were a lot more passionate about it, a lot better at it, a lot smarter than I was. But I found myself going on a project to work on IMAX film, big format film company that we all know or should know because they make incredible products. But I met the founders there as part of that project. And I remember really clearly this sense of like, oh my gosh, like that's incredible. These guys did this in a garage and conceived and then built this business. And that was the first real switch to drop for me. And I literally went back to New York and into my offices and I gave notice 2 weeks later because I realized that I was on a path that I was not going to be good at. It was not going to be a good 25-year journey because I just didn't have the skill set to thrive there. And then the second big piece to your point was I moved on a lark out to San Francisco. I got a phone call from a friend and I knew I was leaving New York. I was heading to Seattle actually. And he said, well, would you ever go to San Francisco? I'm looking for a roommate. So I ended up doing that. It was that random. And then through connections, I found a couple of guys that work in the outdoor industry and I got that job and it was the opposite of banking. I loved it. I was good at it. I was learning all these things. I never wanted to leave the office. And that kind of was the second penny to drop for me, which was loving products, loving making consumer products. And that ultimately morphed into apparel. But it was one of these, kind of life circumstances that changed my career that I'm just eternally grateful for, because I think without me having had that experience, I might still be stuck, doing a job I didn't like and wasn't particularly good at.
Well, it's interesting that your mother had said, do something with your hands as well, create something, because effectively that is what you're doing. But the pressure, because Bayard and I, a little background, Bayard and I went to school together. So we went to Eaglebrook School in Deerfield, Mass, and then went to Deerfield Academy. And this is where you start making your plans for the future, and you see what's around you. And you grew up in Greenwich, Connecticut. And so, yeah, you start seeing the people who are successful, and hey, you're smart, you're competitive. This is the way that you need to go. And I think it really is easy to have those blinders on. Were you always like an outdoor kind of guy though? I mean, snowshoes, like ending up at a snowshoe company. Is that anywhere you ever imagined yourself starting out?
No, I think so. Actually, it's funny to kind of go back and think about this stuff. But so and I don't know whether you and I have ever talked about this, Chris, but my folks got divorced when I was really young, and my mom raised me, and I have two older brothers, and she is a really interesting woman that my dad was paying for all of my education, so I was going to places like Eaglebrook and Deerfield, but I was coming home to a home situation where mom was taking on boarders, and she was renting out the rooms in the house to make her payments, and so I think that instilled in me a certain amount of maybe financial insecurity and kind of wanting to be successful financially. But she had this binary quality to her, that she really wanted us to be able to fix a front stair or to lay down a patio, but she also wanted me to go to Harvard. So it's like this, she was this, there was a lot of value placed on capability by her. And so she really wanted to raise capable sons. And so I think in the rear of my brain, that there was always a lot of desire to make, build, repair, be able to fix things. But in the front part of my brain, I don't think I mapped that to a career. The career mapping just was go make money. You do that by getting into finance, you become a lawyer. And so I think, my guess is you probably were thinking quite, clearly about what you wanted to do with your life in high school. I really wasn't. I was, I wanted to get out of school. I wanted to get working, but those were kind of ill-formed ideas. They weren't kind of career oriented. I always loved being outdoors. I always loved, being in the woods, and I grew up hunting and fishing. And, but the snowshoe thing was a random thing. It was not I want to get into the outdoor industry as much as it was just a circumstantial lucky thing.
It's interesting. I feel like for me, my accident put me on, I had a skiing accident my freshman year in college, and it put me on an entirely different trajectory. But I also remember going back for our 5-year reunion at Deerfield, and it seemed like, I don't know, 90% of the class was in law school.
Yeah.
It seemed like there's a narrowly defined.
Well, it's interesting. I've always, and I don't know if you and I ever talked about this. I've always wondered if this was the case with you in your accident. But for me, there are these moments in life where you hit these intersection moments. One of mine was I lost a lot of weight when I was you remember this, when you knew me, I was probably 60 or 70 pounds overweight. But there are these moments that you hit these intersections or career change, like leaving banking, or your skiing accident where you're in a chair, like these things, they create these intersections. They can go well or badly, obviously. But I do look at these defining moments where in some ways there are these enormous gifts that open up these whole new kind of journeys that you might not otherwise have discovered about yourself, that I find really interesting. And I've always wondered whether that was true about you and your accident, whether it obviously put you on a whole different trajectory. But if there are elements that are like, wow, I never occurred to me that this opportunity was available to me without the accident or losing weight or this fundamental shift in careers or whatever it might be.
Well, it's interesting too, right? Because you have relatively young children.
Yep.
Right. And so, much younger, you started later on. Are you instilling this kind of a message? Are you giving them this kind of a message of like, hey, there's a wide world out there. Don't feel like you have to follow the crowd.
Man, I hope so. My kids are young. They're 4, 6, and 10. My wife is just a force of nature, and she was an architect, and she grew up in a very different household from mine. They were very tight knit and lots of art and creativity there. So I think that there's some part of that us being who we are, just kind of through osmosis gets down to the kids. And I do think that it's helpful to have kids understand there's lots of ways that you can go build a career. I think the one universal thing though is it's got to be underpinned by hard work and best efforts. And I think I hope we parent, and already we're hopefully doing this, is instilling both those things. Figure out what you're good at and what you love, and then work your ass off in support of it. But I think you can't have one without the other. I think, well, you can probably have hard work without loving what you're doing. But I think in a perfect world, you find what you love, and then you break yourself trying to be successful at it. And I think, so I hope we're instilling that. We certainly try to. We're aspiring to do that. And we're trying to do it with our day-to-day actions. I hope they're picking up on it. We'll see. We'll see.
It's a challenge though, isn't it? I mean, I think you learn a lot in the house. You learn some in school, you learn some from your peers, and try to figure out how you piece it together. Let's get to American Giant, because you're talking about a lot of the values. What are the values? Well, like why, we talked about the hoodie. Why did you decide you wanted to make clothing in the US? And, you and I grew up in New England. I grew up in Massachusetts, and I see those mills, right? Mill town.
Yep. Well, so I think that's great context, because we also grew up at a time, call it the early 80s through, the early aughts, let's say, where all of our thinking was around sort of this generalized economic philosophy around libertarian trade and libertarian capitalism and economic policy making, which meant trade is good in every instance all the time, and we want to have an unfettered capitalist system whenever we can. It's the best way to lift people out of poverty and improve quality of living. Those things are all true. I sort of accepted them unquestionably all through my early finance career, my education, and all through the early part of my manufacturing career. But there's more, obviously, like all these things, there's more nuanced around the reality of that. And I think that when you spend any time in manufacturing in the US, which I did throughout my career, and most of my manufacturing stuff has been about starting off with businesses that had manufacturing footprints in the United States and then moving overseas and chasing cheaper means of production. When you do that enough, it's hard to not see what you're leaving in the wake, whether it's the mill towns in Massachusetts or Connecticut or the old textile facilities in the Carolinas. There has been a very profound impact of this pursuit of libertarian trade policy and libertarian economic thinking. There's been some benefits. We can get a flat screen TV for $99 now, but you pay for that move in really profound ways in a I think a declining set of options for a middle and lower middle class working American. I think a increasingly less dimensional economy where we make fewer and fewer things here. And as I watched that in my career, it began to dawn on me that I was at first unsure about the benefits of that decision making and that policy, and that uncertainty moved into feeling like it was not good, and that the apparel industry particularly was really bad. And it was presenting a view to the world that said we care deeply about human rights and gay rights and the environment and global warming, but they were pursuing operational approaches and that was in direct conflict to that they were moving their production to the cheapest means of production, the lowest environmental standards whenever they could. And I had just had my baby, my oldest girl. She was 2 weeks old when I got fired from my old job. And I was beginning to think about what I wanted her to see and the kind of legacy I wanted to leave. And I got really convinced that I wanted to build an apparel business that did things differently and that was more in tune with the values that I had, and I think most Americans have, and wanted to build a business on the back of that could offer up an alternative in the market to customers. So that was not to give you a long answer there, but that was the emotional genesis behind the business. 10 years ago.
to honor your daughter and to leave a legacy and to, you know, in some ways to create this pride.
Well, I mean, but it's back to the question you were asking about, like, how do you instill your values in your kids? Well, probably you do it by what you do every day. And I didn't want to leave a legacy of like, you know, dad did all right. He ripped out a whole bunch of, you know, manufacturing capabilities and moved them overseas and left a bunch of, you know, people without jobs in his wake, but he did well. That just felt not satisfying. And I just to go even further afield, I think a lot of the, you know, the current division in the country can trace its roots back to a growing sense that there's this widening divide between big corporations that are making tons of money and they're, you know, supported by Hollywood and DC and the finance world and the legal world. And then there's kind of everybody else that used to make things in this country and produce things in this country. And those people are really getting left behind. And I just didn't want to be a part of that. And I knew we could build a good business pursuing that. Whether it could be big or small, I didn't know, but I knew we could build a good business, and I knew it would be the kind of business that I'd be proud to run. And that was the extent of my thinking on it, was that I wanted to do something I was proud of, and I would let the marketplace and customers decide whether they wanted to make it a big business, but I wanted to do a business that I was proud of and that I felt had really sturdy values underneath it.
When you told people this, what was the reaction? We're going to build clothing in the US. What was the reaction?
It's funny. I mean, it was mixed, right? I mean, from the vast majority of people that said, it'll never work, don't do it, it's absurd. But revealingly, my oldest brother, Jay, when I told him about it, he's a very disciplined thinker. He's a very smart guy. His reaction was, you got to go do that. Like, that's the business you were born to build. Literally into my, 20 minutes into my hour-long pitch, which is interesting.
And why did he say that? Why was it the business that you were supposed to build?
Because I think he knew, he and I, were brothers. We grew up in the same dynamic. And I think he understood intuitively that this was something that was going to tap into a really core, passionate thing. And I think he probably also intuitively understood that consumers would respond to it with just because we Chris, you and I grew up in the same era. I mean, we grew up around the great American brands, the Levi's and the Wranglers and the Red Wings and the Woolriches and the Champions and all these great brands that stood for something, made great product. They were made here. And I just felt, I think he and I both understood that, those were not in the market anymore, and that there was an opportunity from a business standpoint to maybe rebuild a business like that customers would really respond to as well. So I think he saw both the personal piece of that and then also the business opportunity. So there was mixed reaction, but most people said, don't do it.
Well, it's nice to have an endorsement from somebody you respect, though, as well.
Exactly. It helps.
who would certainly not spare your feelings for honesty, right?
Well, that's right. I mean, that's exactly right. That's intuitive. I mean, he would have told me just as comfortably, it's a terrible idea, don't do that. And I respect his opinion a bunch. So it was a good endorsement to get.
How has it been going back to some of these places, going back to the Carolinas, meeting with some of these people? Because this is generational too, isn't it? People who had worked in these mills and the pride that they have that in some ways has been taken from them, right?
Yeah. So there is, I think one of the most gratifying parts of building American Giant and the supply chain has been that. And on the negative side, for the last 40 years, as we have really encouraged big businesses to move their production overseas, the business, the capital has gone with it. And so there's now this weird imbalance that if you go to facilities in places like Guangzhou or Shenzhen in China, you'll see textile facilities and footwear facilities that are automated, advanced, they're well lit. There's the kind of latest and greatest technology and innovation happening there. In many cases, the factories that you go to domestically, they've been undercapitalized and underinvested with. And to your point, they oftentimes are generational businesses that have been within the same family for 2 or 3 generations. They tend to have not a lot of available capital to automate and to invest. Interesting conversations there about what the role of the federal government ought to be in terms of supporting these family businesses to help them keep competitive. So on the one hand, going into these facilities was like, wow, this is going to be a challenge. On the other hand, there was this deep wealth of expertise and know-how. There was a incredible sense of just give us a shot. We can do this. Like, give us a chance. And on top of all that, there was the ability, and I say this a bunch, I probably said it to you before, that in a day, basically, you can travel with me and see cotton getting harvested out of the ground, ginned at a local gin, spun into yarn, knitted into cloth, and sewn into a sweatshirt in, if you get up early enough with me at 6 a.m, and by the end of the day, you'll see the finished product coming off the line. That integrated connection to the product was just the most invigorating thing I've ever been a part of in my life. And so there was good and bad, but the good way outweighed the bad. And we now have this dynamic supply chain that is all across the country and thousands of people, and the enthusiasm and the expertise and the quality is incredible. So it's been a very gratifying, very exciting part of the supply chain, but it's not without its challenges, because the supply chain is relatively outdated and underinvested compared to what else is out there. So,
and that's the challenge, isn't it? Because it's almost like, I mean, you're a team with these other companies, but at the same time, it's almost like you're building a couple of companies or a few companies where it's not just your company. You're having to hopefully help ensure that this other company will be successful so they can continue to work with you as well.
Yeah, I mean, that is a complexity for sure, is that you truly do enter into partnership with your supply chain in ways that are, I certainly didn't appreciate and understand going into it, and that make it maybe more challenging logistically, but also those are outweighed by great working relationships and personal interaction. So we do get into situations where we are working with factories to say, okay, we need 30,000 of these sweatshirts, and they say, great, can you stretch out the production across 3 months? Not what we want. We'd like to forget everything, but maybe we'll whack it up into 12,000 units a month to hit the target and level load their capability. On the other hand, when things like the pandemic hit, I can call up on a first name basis our supply chain partners and say, listen, we don't know what's happening here. We don't know how bad this is going to be. We need you guys to hang tight, cancel our current orders. And in that instance, across the supply chain, we had partners saying, we got it, and don't worry about it. We'll take care of you, and don't worry about these orders. We'll sit on them till you need them. And so it cuts both ways. And so those, the depth of those relationships has been in some cases difficult to navigate, but they've more than paid off in that working relationship and how integrated we are with those partnerships. So it's been different than any manufacturing role I've ever been a part of in my career. So,
well, it's funny too, right? Because it brings a greater sense of responsibility, and a responsibility to the product, to your company, to your investors, to your suppliers. And how has that been? Because you started with next to nothing. I mean, you started with this idea that you said, hey, this is going to be a great idea, we should do it. And then you go from the idea to, okay, let's make this happen. What's the story that you told yourself as you were going along, saying, we're going in the right direction, keep going, don't quit? What's the story you told yourself there?
Well, in the early days, that's a lonely journey, right? Because the questions are big and hard to navigate, and there's at least as many failures as there are glimmers of hope that are happening, and hurdles you got to clear, dead ends you run down. So I think, and maybe this is connected to that Slate article coming out that we can talk about in a minute, but then you get sort of externalities that give you confidence. But those are, those take time to generate. But back to the product itself, I will tell you this, that when you are as intimately involved as we are in the making of a product, a sweatshirt or a pair of jeans or a jacket or something, where you are meeting and working with the cotton growers and the ginners and the yarners and the knitters and kind of all the steps along the way, and you're in those facilities, those people, the people that's doing the napping on the fleece that you're producing, and you're seeing those component parts come through the line. It creates a connection to your point, to the suppliers, to the men and women that are making that stuff, but to the product itself. And you have this heightened sense of responsibility and stewardship over the products that you make, and the commitment with the people that make them on your behalf and in partnership with you, and the customer that ultimately is going to support it. And so, I always think about, knowing intimately those components of the supply chain it's hard for me to articulate to you how me knowing a cotton farmer in North Carolina results in a better sweatshirt, but it does, because it does deepen this connection to the products that you make. And so I think that alone, just the process of building that initial sweatshirt that we built, and seeing that begin to come together, and seeing the enthusiasm that began to come out of the men and women that were making it, and the quality of the fleece we were making, and the raw materials we were adding, and the draw cords, that creates its own momentum and confidence, and that really carried us for that first year. It was really believing, wow, we made something special here, and we were proud of it, and we were able to do it. And that gives you a lot of tailwind in those early months.
Well, it also sounds like, I mean, we started this conversation with the concept of the essential in some ways, of building something with your hands, of building it from the ground, of being able to touch it, and almost like, the tactile sense, as opposed to a spreadsheet sense of like, boom, 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 this is the way these things go, right? And it seemed like on a visceral level for you, that was part of who you were, and that connection to these people reinforces that both for you and the product. Is that fair to say?
Yeah, and I would also just say that, like, just in your own, in all of our own kind of frame of references here, like that beer on Friday night tastes a hell of a lot better after you've worked your tail off all week, and you've been productive, and you've been necessary, than if you spent a week sitting around and not doing much. And I can just tell you that when you start to go into these facilities that were shuttered or were underemployed or understaffed, and you start to see people that are a part of producing the products that we make, and the pride and the contribution that goes along with it, that is just tremendously energizing and rewarding. And we did this big effort 2 years ago to build a flannel in the U.S., for example, and that was a big undertaking. But little by little, as that began to work itself out, we began to solve little and big problems, and new facilities came online, and there's a momentum that builds with that. And you begin to assemble these people. Like, we brought this one guy out of retirement that was an old yarn dyer, and you suddenly have this, it's almost like assembling like the 1980 Olympic hockey team. You have all these people that are coming together, and they're like, wait, I think we can do this. And then someone on the other side of them was like, listen, I know how we can get that yarn dyeing done. And there's this energy that builds, and this pride. And so it is that piece. I'm not sure I understood that was going to be so present, but that is a piece that makes getting up every day just feeling like I've got the best job in the world, because you get to be a part of this incredible confluence of talent and drive and passion that is just totally invigorating. And there's this sense of like awakening in the U.S. manufacturing piece on textiles. It's like, whoa, everyone's talking about this dead. It's not dead. There are these incredible parts of capability. Like, we've almost done a 180 in that it's shocking to us that more of these larger corporations don't say, wait, I'm going to get out of this complex, environmentally terrible globalized supply chain and start doing more stuff here because it's working. Like, there's lots of stuff here that we can be really competitive at and really good at. So it's been really neat.
It's part of who we are as people, isn't it? I mean, the idea
Totally.
of like, we want to belong. And when we belong, we're willing to pour our heart into it. But if we don't feel like that's going to be, reciprocated or whatever, it's like, we don't want to get our heart stomped on, but we want to belong. And have you seen other companies? Have you seen people coming to you wanting to be part of what you're doing as a result of, just the general feeling, the culture of the company?
Yeah, I would say that a couple of thoughts about that. I think it's the belonging, and it's the just the intuitive recognition that we should be honoring and rewarding people for good work, and we ought to be providing the opportunity for people to put in a good week's work, and to hold open the possibility that they're going to be able to pass on a better life for their kids if they put in 30 years of a career working hard. And so I think that is a very human nature kind of thing, that we all intuitively understand that. And then to your second question about people that I think there's a lot of really great companies that are out there that are doing a lot of great things. And I think that there's a recognition, Chris, you were a part of our Delta project, which is where we highlight people in all different segments of society that are are good, strong voices for change and improvement. And I think there is a sense about surrounding yourselves with other people of like mind and kind of getting the brand in good company with other people and other brands, other leaders. I think that does happen a lot. I think people see an American Giant, maybe an unwillingness to hear no. And that through line that's a truism for, your career and the advocacy that you do and the outreach you do with people and children about overcoming diversity and obstacles and things like that. I think that universal point of view, that there's almost a mentality, like I want to surround myself with people that see the finish line. They don't see the hurdles in between. And so in that regard, I think we do work with other companies. We're actually in the middle of a project right now with Sam Adams, the beer company. But I think people of a like mind tend to find one another, and the good news is there's lots and lots of people that are doing phenomenal stuff all across the country. Most of them get into our catalog. You were on the cover of one of our catalogs for that reason. And so I think that it goes both ways. We like to affiliate ourselves with a bunch of other people and businesses, and they hopefully us, and that circle tends to build as you start to be around and affiliate with folks. That starts to build its own momentum. So yeah,
which is cool. And so yes, I was in your catalog, and you celebrate the stories of people in your catalogs, and certainly Sam Adams is a similar kind of thing, right? Where he was an analyst, had grown up in the beer industry, and then with the family, and decided I wanted to go into it. And his father's like, "Don't do that. Don't go into the beer industry." So
yeah, unlike my brother, I believe this is true. His dad told him, like, that is the stupidest idea I've ever heard. But he did. I mean, he made a pretty basic bet too. I'm gonna build a good beer. It's going to cost a bit more. I'm going to put in the simplest, best ingredients I can with the best processes I can, and customers are going to care about it. And it's a simple story, but it's a powerful one, and it's one that resonates with us a lot. Actually, there's some phenomenal parallels between the making of a good lager and the making of a good sweatshirt in terms of the integrated nature of the supply chains and the emphasis on ingredients and stuff. So, but anyway, that's just an example of, I think, hopefully you live by a set of pretty simple values. You live by them, you don't waver, and that attracts some attention and some like-minded folks around the business. And that's been the case with us. We've been lucky enough to have a lot of people on the company that we really admire.
Now, how did that work, right? Because you connected with some great people. You feel like you want to go to work every day. When did it happen that people started buying your stuff, where you realized, okay, we can be around? I remember it was early on with like the Rolling Stones, right? And they were interviewing Mick, and they'd had a decent album, and he's like, yeah, I think that means that we can be around for like another 3 years, like early 60s kind of thing. And you're like, 3 years or 45 or whatever it is, either or. When did you feel like, hey, we can actually really be around?
Oh man, I don't know if you ever do. But I'll tell you my journey on that in that regard. So there was the ideation phase, like, I think this is the kind of business I want to build. And then there was a year of developing the first product and getting all those elements. That was all breathtaking and scary. And I had an investor that kind of underwrote that made it possible. That was we're very lucky to have him around. And then we launched the product about a year later. And, I had this naive idea that this product was going to be so great that people would care and they support the company. And we had no marketing. We just said, we're going to launch it.
You need that, right? You need that naivete to go, hey, we're going to build a great thing and people are going to love it, right?
It's just like, fair enough. But God, I look back at that and I'm like, that is just the stupidest thing. Like, the internet's a lonely place if no one knows you're there. And so we did, at launch, we got a little bit of attention and a few people bought. And this was in February of 2012. And we were just making a men's only sweatshirt at that point. And there was enough there that for the next 8 or 10 months, I convinced myself that I should keep the lights on and show up at work every day. And, Chris would show up and buy a sweatshirt. And then maybe a month later, he'd show up again and buy his brother one. And there was enough there that I was like, hey, that's someone is liking the product enough to buy it a second time. Like, okay, maybe we're onto something here. But it was lean living that first year. And then in December of 2012, I think, or maybe late November, as you mentioned, we got an article written in Slate Magazine that was at the time just a digital publication, that the title of the sweatshirt was, "This is the greatest hoodie ever made." And the brief backstory on that is that the guy that wrote that is a guy named Farhad Manjoo. He's now an editorial writer for the New York Times. But Farhad at that time was living down south of San Francisco and was writing for Slate. And I was an admirer of his. And I sent him an email and said, "Hey, Farhad, I think I'd love you to look at this. I think we make a really great sweatshirt." And I think he was like, "I'm sick of writing about tech."
Hold on. According to him, you were a little bit more forceful than that. I think
That's true. That's probably right.
You're saying, "I think we make a great sweatshirt." From him, it was like, we have the greatest sweatshirt. We have the greatest sweatshirt ever, right?
All right. That's probably right. So in either case, I somehow got him. And my guess is, on the far as I never said this to him, my guess is he probably was like, I get to go out and do something different for a few hours. But that few hour meeting turned into 4 days of really deep research into the business and the philosophy behind the business and the sweatshirt itself. And anyway, he wrote that article, and that article was like a bomb detonating in the living room. I mean, I do not think it's an overstatement to say that without that article, we wouldn't be here. It went totally viral, and we sold out of everything we had. We sold out of everything that we had on order, every bit of yarn, every bit of fabric. And that tipped us into a position where we were chasing orders for the next 3.5 years, almost 4 years. And, back order lines that lasted for 6 months. And the reason why that article mattered, well, it mattered because it got us bigger. And so we became more sustainable and all that stuff. That all helped. But as I thought back on that, in some ways, the most important thing it did is it gave me the confidence that I was onto something that was resonating. And that, it is lonely when you're an entrepreneur. I mean, you just don't know. You don't know if people care enough. Into the Rolling Stones analogy, even now, I mean, I can't tell you how much it matters to have a customer email me, write me a letter, call me up and say, "I love your sweatshirt." I mean, it's just like, it gets me so excited and so grateful now. And some of that is just still in that very fragile relationship. Are we doing the best that we can be doing? And how's our service? And how are our products? And so I don't know if you ever get to a point where you're like, "Oh, we got it now." I'm certainly incrementally more confident about the business now. It's much bigger. We make jeans and jackets, and men's and women's, we have retail stores and all these other things. But it still is almost a daily kind of questioning about, are we being as good as we could be? And is the product great? And so I certainly more confident today, but I don't know if we've reached a point where we're like, "Oh, we got this." We're not there for sure.
So now when you sold out, I mean, this is a watershed moment, right? You sold out for months. You're trying to fulfill orders, which is great because you also know that there's money continuing to come in, right? Which is one of the biggest worries when you're an entrepreneur. I have people who are here, I need to keep paying them. It's the confirmation of who you are. But was that a scary moment too? Like, I mean, is there the imposter syndrome of it? Is there, how do you reconcile that kind of stuff and say, "Yeah, I'm going forward. Like, I'm ready. I know what I'm doing." Totally.
Yeah. I mean, so let me just say that back to you. You're riding this wave. You're questioning, wait, is this just a momentum on the back of an article of one reporter, and is there substance? And so that was absolutely there. It still is to a certain extent about wondering. We launched new programs. And so we launched women's in 2014, 2 years later. That was a breathtaking moment. Now women are more than half the business. Will women appreciate the brand? We launched t-shirts. Does our sweatshirt customer, will they care about t-shirts? We launched denim. Yeah, exactly. Like denim. One. Jackets. Yeah. Thank you for that, by the way. But all those questions those are all scary. And they all cause you to ask the question, like, do we have permission to be there? Does the customer want us to be there? Do we know how to do that well? Flannel, making a great flannel. Do we know how to do that? And so there is that, it's a nice way to think about it. There is that constant sense about, and we, by the way, have had tons of failures. We've pushed into categories maybe that we haven't done that well, or invested a bunch of money into products that didn't bear out, or we couldn't ultimately make. And so absolutely there is. And I think little by little, I think you do begin to gain more confidence. Some of it is just, you're big enough that you can make mistakes and it's not going to bother you much. and some of it is that you begin to assemble, we have just a phenomenal team at American Giant now. And, the product team here and the development team and the manufacturing team are just amazing. None of that was in place 10 years ago. So you begin to build in the capability that, you start to hire people that are way better at the job than you could ever be. That provides some measure of confidence. And so little by little, I think that you mitigate that, but it took a while. And there's still some of that as you enter a new category. You still always have that question back in your brain, like, are we going to be great at this or not? And hopefully we have the wisdom to identify when we can't be great at something and we don't do it. So, it's an interesting evolution, that little by little, that growing sense about, are we more stable? Are we going to last? Are we going to be here? Can we be good in this category? It's an interesting thing to kind of step back from and try to think about.
What's the reaction from the apparel industry? Because you guys are disruptors, right? You're coming in, everybody's going, no, you can't do it. You've got to go to Thailand. You've got to go to China. You're going to North Carolina.
Yeah, it's interesting. We have an uncomfortable relationship with the industry as a whole, I think, because to your point, we really are, we are a pretty clear counterpoint to the accepted narrative. And it's an uncomfortable narrative, right? Because if you dig on it a little bit and start to ask why, if you, on the face of it, if you truly cared about environmental impact of the apparel industry, you would not be putting T-shirts on big tankers and send them across oceans and burning the world's dirtiest fuel. It's just terrible for the environment. You wouldn't pursue disposable clothing where you're throwing away huge amounts of clothing every year and incinerating it or putting it in a landfill. If you cared about human rights, you would not be making in places that don't have good human rights laws. And so all these things, I think we're posing uncomfortable questions to the industry. So that's one side of it. The other side of it is there are a handful of American-based apparel companies who are genuinely trying to do the right thing. Some of them are private; they've got a bit more flexibility. Some of them are public and have to answer to shareholders, but are trying to do the right thing and are not certain as to how to do it. Because for the public companies, they have to balance their financial performance and the pressure on shareholders in the short term with what is the long-term health of the business. And for the private companies, there may be questions about, and for the public companies too, about if we acknowledge that we are not making things in the best way and we're trying to correct it, does that expose the fact that we're not making things in the best way? But I will say that among the domestic companies, we have brought a number of them through our supply chain, the senior leaders of those companies, and shown them how we're doing things. And I'm of a mind that we happen to make all of our stuff in the US, from the cotton in the ground all the way through. We're pretty purist about that. But that is not necessarily what everyone needs to do. For the big apparel companies, just progress, just movement in the right direction would help. Putting a program in US factories, making a commitment to a % of their production being domestic would help to build up the capability and the velocity in the US supply chain. And so there's this public facing piece of it where I think everyone's kind of uncomfortable with what we're doing because we're exposing a lie in the apparel industry that needs to be exposed, in my judgment. But privately, I think there's a lot more openness to learning and figuring out what we're doing and how we're doing it and what the challenges have been and what the opportunities are. And I'm super optimistic about what's coming in the next 10 years of textiles. I think the momentum has built a bunch, and there's policy changes that are coming. There's consumer awareness that's coming. And I think brands are starting to wake up to that and move in a way that's super encouraging.
And people are listening to you, it sounds like. I mean, do they listen? Because you're you're like a punk kid.
Yeah, it's hard not to, right? I mean, it's hard. There's a point at which it becomes hard not to listen to it, right? As we get bigger, as consumers start to talk about it, as I, am invited on to be with people like you and people hear about it, it begins to raise questions that I think people have to answer. And I think I think it just distills down into a simple idea that, are we as consumers comfortable with having really appropriate standards, in my mind, about labor rates and environmental protections? Are we okay with allowing our biggest corporations that are making the most money to squirt away from those regulations and controls to places that don't honor those regulations? Is that an okay thing for us while we basically penalize our domestic producers? I think that conversation is moving into the center of the table. And I think, as I often say, maybe you got two completely different administrations, the Trump administration, the Biden administration. One of the few places they've totally aligned on is a question about domestic manufacturing and our trade policy and trying to rebalance our trade playing field. And so I think that the policymakers are in some ways are out in front of the brands in this case, which is never a good place to be. You want to be the other way around. And so I think the brands are realizing that and trying to cycle up and make some change. And hopefully I'll continue to get a chance to speak loudly about it and get people to be thinking about it as clear-headedly as they need to be, in my judgment.
Which is great. And we certainly hope that that's what you get a chance to do as well. When you're creating these values, because in some ways you said that you sort of ended up here. I mean, almost by accident in some ways. I mean, it's a confluence, and who knows where your career is going to go. If you had an idea when you were 12 years old of like, this is what I'm going to do, the high likelihood is that you were either going to be wrong or you were going to be unhappy. And you kind of find your way as you go along. Have you acquired heroes within this industry? The people that you look at and say, that person's speaking my language, and that gives me hope that I can continue to shout loudly from the.
Yeah, I think for sure. I think as a general statement, I think when you see people that have the conviction of what they believe in and are willing to invest in, what's right versus what's easy, that tends to be a pretty good indicator of people that are worthy of admiration. And I think, there's a number of businesses that kind of meet that standard. Patagonia is an easy one, right? Which is a company that is, I think, people forget that it comes around for a long time. And Yvon Chouinard had to make lots and lots of decisions that put values and quality above growth. And I think that's those are really hard decisions to make. And I bet, what appears to us as outsiders and looking into that brand probably seems like linear and clear. My guess is that there were lots of hard decisions there and hard discussions about, do we really want to turn away this business or change the way that we're doing something based on our values? Those are hard things to do. But when you see leaders that are doing that or have the conviction to do it and the patience to do it, those are leaders that I really admire. And that happens across all of our lives. It's not just business where that appears. It's in politicians, it's in activists, it's in speakers and artists and business leaders. So yeah, I think people like Yvon Chouinard are definitely ones that I find myself looking towards and feeling are good spiritual guides about reminding yourself that it may not be the easiest way, but it's the better way, and stick to your guns. Do what you believe, stick to it, and the customers will follow. But you got to lead. You got to lead from the front on that stuff.
Yeah, it's a hard one, right? Because it's easy to have your head down and just grinding away, and we've got to keep growing, and we've got to keep satisfying this, and we have more people, and we have to pay these people. I mean, I actually just read Chouinard's book, Let My People Go Surfing, right? Which is at the essence of why he started the company. Mm-hmm. But remembering that as time goes on can be the challenge. This is who we are. This is why we started, and how do we move on? You talked about, as the CEO, as the founder, that it can be a really lonely place to be. Like there aren't, like you have this responsibility. You can't really vent to your employees because you have to have this strong face moving forward of like, no, we're good. We've got this. We're optimistic. But you also created from the outside, you brought in some of your network, right? You brought in like your investor is the father of a good friend of yours, right? A good childhood friend. Uh-huh. And I mean, I say this all the time, like we went to some pretty impressive schools, and I feel like my parents paid for my network. And yeah, and I think you brought in a lot of these people. How was that? What was that a conscious move that you did it? And how did it end up feeling for you? How did it end up empowering you?
Well, was it a conscious decision that I tapped into my network throughout my career? 100%. I mean, you're absolutely right that when you have the privilege to grow up in a place like, Greenwich, Connecticut, or in the towns surrounding Greenwich, Connecticut, or you go to a school like Deerfield, you meet an incredible network of people that, I have been, I think one of the lessons I really took from my mom was a, I don't know, almost a dogmatic approach to kind of grabbing every opportunity that was presented to you. So my whole life I've been I think focused on cultivating that network, that professional network. With a specific example of Mr. Kendall, who was the original investor in American Giant, in the town that I grew up in. When my folks got divorced, he was one of the only a few parents, and he and his wife Bim, who really looked out for my mom and by extension us, and he became a father figure for me, and somebody who was around, who was present, who was successful. And as I got out of college, I would go and see him once a year and buy him a coffee and just update him on what I was doing and what questions I had and all this stuff. And he said to me when I talked to him I was thinking about starting American Giant, he said, I'm going to write the first check. I want to invest in you. So that one wasn't intentional. That was more just, he was a very important professional guide and mentor of mine, and then became a really critical investor and kind of steadying hand for the business. He is a guy that, he built Pepsi-Cola essentially, and he was a product guy, a customer guy through and through. And that matters when you are in a situation like we were with the back order and the Slate situation. It can get really tempting to say, let's drop quality standards. Let's go overseas. Let's rush the volume through so we can capture this demand. And he was the guy that was saying, hey man, what are we doing here? Let's remember, what are we doing here? And that patience and steadiness that came, he was 90 years old at that point, and he'd seen it all. And that patience and steadiness to say, we're playing for, 5 innings from now, not for right now. That I don't know if I would have had the conviction to do that on my own if I didn't have him there with me. So, Chris, with all these things, it's like, these stories are all, I think, they're as much informed by luck and circumstance as skill and insight. I mean, there are so many things along the way with American Giant that, had things broken a different way, we wouldn't be here. If I didn't have Mr. Kendall, if the Slate article didn't happen, if we weren't able to jump factories when we needed to, there are all these moments that put the business on right on the edge of failing that we got through. And so much of that happens to be who you happen to be near or next to, or the advice you get at the time, I think.
It's funny though too, because it's easy. Like you've benefited from some of those things that you can call luck. With my organization, we've been putting out a quote every week, and I was quoting I studied acting at one point, and my acting professor had said that luck is when preparation meets opportunity. And it was like Aurelius or somebody like that who had actually said it first.
Yeah.
Frank had said it, really is what it came down to for me. But there's a lot in that, right? I mean, you made some really important steps along the way, and you were prepared for luck, or you were prepared to a certain extent for luck. You were back ordered for a while. You weren't prepared to say, yeah, we've got a warehouse full of stuff that we can serve all of you people. But the thing is, if you had a warehouse full of stuff, you wouldn't have slept for months with that full warehouse thinking when.
Yeah. I mean, I think that's true. I think some of it probably is preparation, and it's nice to hear, and it's nice to think that's the case. I think that's part of it probably. I think there's another part of it that is just, if you keep your shoulder against the blocking sled long enough and keep pumping your legs, eventually you'll get a breakthrough. And I think that's also true too, that I do. One of the I think that is true about me is I'm really dogmatic and persistent about stuff, and I kind of don't hear no. And that, I think, in some ways maybe puts you in a position where if you're at it long enough, you'll eventually have someone come along to say, all right, I'll help. I'll write you a 25 grand check, or, I'll wait long enough to get your sweatshirt. So.
Well, he didn't just put in a boatload of money too, right? I mean, this was
that's right.
Dribs and drabs where he's like, yeah, I'll give enough to get to tomorrow.
Yeah, he was one of the most remarkable men I've ever met. I mean, he at a personal level, he was a great father to his children. He was a great husband to his wife. He was an incredible business leader, and he had time for me and all of that. And he was very tough, very demanding. But to your point, he wrote a $25,000 check and gave me a series of deliverables to hit. And he said, if you hit them, I might put in more. And in retrospect, it was a great way to navigate those first couple of years, because it made us deliver. in a way that maybe if had we gotten a big check into the company would have made us a little bit more lazy or less disciplined about the way we were doing things. So he was on the big things. He almost always got it right. He was a big picture thinker that kind of cut through the bullshit a lot and was a very, very helpful professional guide, mentor to me. Big part of the American Giant story, actually.
You've had some success now, and you can feel a little bit more comfortable. Do you maintain, and how do you maintain the feeling of being that underdog, of having to be scrappy?
That's a really interesting question. I don't feel like we've attained success, I guess. I think I'm much more in the mentality of like, there are these huge apparel companies that are doing it wrong and we gotta set things right. There's very much a competitive David and Goliath mentality in the whole company here. I mean, every member of our team, we got about 50 people here in San Francisco, and then a whole bunch more in North Carolina where we make things, South Carolina and North Carolina, we make things. And there is a tremendous sense of we are in a toe-to-toe, pistols drawn battle with the apparel industry.
And you're the outsider too, right?
Oh, yeah. Yeah. We are the outsider that no one wants crashing the gates. Yeah. I mean, I think that we are exposing a bunch of stuff that makes people really uncomfortable. And so that is at the core of what drives this business. I mean, there's everyone in this organization. I mean, the level of passion and conviction about what we're doing is just profound. And it all comes from this place that like, wait a minute, this apparel industry that's like Instagramming about how much they care about the environment, and they're terrible. They're like terrible. And yet they're trying to convince us to be given credit for that. So I think that's the fuel to the fire right there, I think.
Do you enjoy that role? Do you enjoy being that outsider, being the burr in the saddle kind of thing or whatever?
Yeah. 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 Hell yeah, I do. Particularly, I think that the apparel industry is just, I think they're full of shit. I think it's just a mess. And I think they're basically lying and they're getting rich doing it. That's unacceptable. You got to get into that fight.
That is awesome. I love it. Well, Bayard, unfortunately, we've got to get you out now. You've got to go get into a different fight.
I'd rather finish this conversation, but Chris, I really appreciate it. It is always inspiring and a joy to talk to you, man. I'll do it anytime.
It's a total pleasure. So Bayard, thank you for joining us. Thank you for what you're doing. Thank you for the clothing they're putting out there and fighting the good fight. For all of you who've had a chance to join us, I hope you've enjoyed the conversation that Bayard and I have had today. If you have, please tell your friends. Please follow us. Please like us. We're on YouTube. We're on Spotify. We're on Apple. Follow us on all the usual suspects, and please help us give people an opportunity to hear great stories like Bayard's. Bayard, thanks a ton, buddy.
Chris, great being with you. Thank you, man. Talk to you soon.
Total pleasure. Thank you. Thank you for joining us. Please subscribe to Chris Waddell Living It for more stories on the adaptive community, the Paralympics, artists, athletes, entrepreneurs, experts in the experience of being human. Also follow us on Spotify, Apple, Facebook, and Instagram. I look forward to seeing you next week.